Okay, guys, in this lesson, we're going to be learning about the period of the Vietnam conflict, which was a 15-year conflict, really a 15-year war. And we're going to be looking at the 1960s and 70s, but the center of the lesson is going to be the conflict in Vietnam. So, one of the things that we're going to see with the Cold War is this policy called containment. So, there was a theory called the domino theory, and that theory taught that if one country falls to communism, then the next country could fall, and the next country could fall. And like dominoes, you would have the world taken over by communism. This was out of our fear that the Soviet Union, which was a communist country, was trying to take over the world by putting communist governments around the world. So we're going to develop a policy called containment as a result of the domino theory. And what containment taught was that anywhere that we could stop communism from spreading, in other words, we could contain it, then we were going to get involved and do so. And there are going to be two wars that we actually fight as a result of this policy called containment, two big wars. They're called proxy wars because really we're fighting communism from spreading, but we're fighting it from spreading in two specific places. The first is in Korea, where North Korea is going to become communist and invade South Korea, which was democratic. And the second place is Vietnam, where the North Vietnamese were communist and the South Vietnamese were democratic. And so we're going to get involved in both places. In Korea, that was in the 1950s. And what we saw was that the northern part of Korea invaded the democratic South. And so we're going to be part of a United Nations force. It's really led by us. You know, we called it a UN force, but the United States sent most of the troops to Korea. And we're going to fight in Korea. Pretty much we're going to fight to a stalemate where neither side gains. We lose a lot of men, lose a lot of soldiers, but we don't really gain anything. But we did manage to keep communism from spreading into South Korea. Now, at one time, we actually had taken over a good portion of North Korea, and it looked like we were going to actually advance and make North Korea a democratic place, but ultimately the Chinese helped get involved and we're pushed back. But we are able to keep South Korea a democratic country. We still have obviously we still have an alliance with South Korea, and North Korea is still a democratic dictatorship at this point with uh, Kim Jong Un running that country. So there's still division there today, but the 54th parallel is what separated North and South Korea. Really, it was an imaginary line that separates the northern communist part of Korea from the southern democratic part of Korea because there was no natural boundary there. Similarly, we're going to become involved in Vietnam, which is in Southeast Asia, as a result of the North Vietnamese invading the South Vietnamese. So we're going to come to the aid of the democratic South out of our fear that communism is going to spread there. And that conflict is going to last 15 years and is going to result in over 50,000 American deaths. It's a devastating conflict. All right, one of the one of the things that makes it very difficult to fight in Vietnam is distinguishing between friend and enemy. And that part of the reason is because in South Vietnam, there was a force called the Viet Cong. And the Viet Cong were allies to the North Vietnamese, so they were communists, but they lived in the South. And so distinguishing between the South Vietnamese who were friends and the South Vietnamese who were enemies was very difficult. Making it even more difficult was the practice that the Viet Cong used called guerrilla warfare, where they would use these hit and run tactics in the jungles of Vietnam. They were very familiar with the jungles. We were not. Our troops were not. So they would ambush our troops, fire, kill people, and then get out of there. That's called guerrilla war. They would also use children to kill our troops, which made it even more difficult because you wouldn't expect a child to be a threat, and yet some children were threats. That's going to lead to some really, really bad things happening in Vietnam, some of them by our own troops. Now, not making excuses for the troops that did do bad things, and by the way, that wasn't the majority of troops, but some of our troops are going to be caught killing innocents and targeting children, and not making excuses, but if you understand how the Viet Cong operated, you understand why that kind of thing could happen, even though it was wrong and bad. Now, one of the reasons that our efforts in Vietnam are going to increase is in the early 60s, Congress did not declare war in Vietnam, but what they did do is they allowed the president at the time, Lyndon Johnson, to increase our troop presence there. So they basically gave him a blank check. It's called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. As a response to an incident that happened in the Gulf of Tonkin, we're going to respond by giving Lyndon Johnson, President Johnson, a lot of leeway in how he wants to conduct this conflict and this war, really. So even though we don't declare war in Vietnam, Johnson is able to do whatever he wants to do, and he's going to send in massive amounts of troops. The key term was by any means necessary to win. So he's going to send in massive amounts of troops to fight. And as we send more troops over there, we become entrenched over there, and it's very difficult for us to get out because it seems like victory is right around the corner, but every time we look like we're going to win a victory, we take a step back because of that guerrilla warfare, because it was so difficult to make gains there. And so gradually, as we become more and more involved in Vietnam, it looks like there's no end in sight, and the American people begin to grow tired of it. When Johnson leaves office, Richard Nixon is going to become president. He's a different political party than Johnson. Johnson was a Democrat. Nixon is a Republican. And what we're going to see with Nixon is that he's going to promote this idea called Vietnamization, which we'll look at in a minute. All right, so what we're going to see in the United States during the conflict is protests are going to break out. There was a group of people, especially on college campuses, that began to protest the war. Many of them had been drafted into the Army. So back then, we put in a draft where people could be forced to join the military. But many of the people who were of draft age dodged the draft. Now, not everyone, of course, many, if you were drafted, you went in. But some people managed to get out of it, either by running, fleeing, or by coming up with some medical excuse to dodge the draft. It's called draft dodging, getting out of military service for really a reason that wasn't a good reason, except that many of these people felt like a draft was illegal and that it was not right for a country to draft and force people to serve in their military. So we're going to see protests break out on these college campuses. Unfortunately, there are two things that happen here. Number one, as our troops begin to come home, troops that come home are not treated well by some of these protesters. Not all of them, but some of them, they do not treat the soldiers well at all. And many of these soldiers, of course, are just doing their duty as American soldiers in the military. They haven't done anything wrong. They've just fought with our military, and so they didn't deserve to be treated so poorly. The other thing is we start to see some of these protests turn violent. Some of it was between the National Guard, who were called in, and the protesters. And one incident on Kent State at Kent State University in Ohio, we're going to see 9 people injured, including 4 college students killed as a result of the protests. This was a devastating time in American history, the 60s, during these protests in early 70s. There was a lot of upheaval. Some kind of feels maybe a little bit like what America's going through today, in that there's a lot of upheaval and discord and disagreement about things. Well, that certainly was true in the 60s in America, and we saw that with these protests. So Richard Nixon, who's going to be president, he's going to become president in 1968. He vows to bring our troops home through a process called Vietnamization. And what Vietnamization was was the idea that we were going to train the South Vietnamese to take care of themselves, to fight for themselves. And over a period of time, as we began to train more of their troops, we would then withdraw our troops. So basically, they would fight their own war. And so that's what's going to happen. Vietnamization and the Nixon doctrine is going to be, we're going to pull back as we train these troops. Now, what ends up happening is, as we pull out of Vietnam, it doesn't last very long. The South Vietnamese are incapable. They don't have the they didn't have the equipment or even the ability to defend themselves. They didn't have an army our size or well trained as our army, and so the North Vietnamese are going to overrun South Vietnam very quickly, which basically means we were over there for 15 years, and the end is we lose. The South Vietnamese get taken over by the communists. So it really was, not good. But the American people by that point, by the mid 70s, early 70s, were ready for the Vietnam War to end. And so they were just ready in any way possible for our troops to come home. Very similar to what happened in the Second Iraq War in the early 2000s. All right, so what's going to happen with Nixon is we're going to have a scandal called the Watergate scandal. And Nixon as president is going to be a very paranoid person. He's just a person who, despite the fact that he rises to the level of president, he always is looking over his shoulder like somebody's trying to get him. And so in 1972, when he runs for re-election, he has a massive lead. He's going to win re-election, but his paranoia gets the best of him. And so he hires a group of criminals basically to break in to the Watergate Hotel. And in the Watergate Hotel, there were the Democratic National Committee kept their headquarters there. And they break into Democratic National Headquarters and basically steal secrets, steal campaign secrets. So, every campaign has a strategy for how they're going to win, including the Democrats in 1972. They had a strategy for how they were going to run against Nixon. Now, the truth is it didn't matter. He was going to win anyway. But he was so paranoid, he wanted to know what their strategy was. So he had people break into the hotel and steal their secrets. When word gets back that this has happened, those criminals get caught and some of them start to spill the beans a little bit. Well, Nixon tries to stay above the fray and he denies having any knowledge of this at all. Well, it turns out that he had full knowledge of the break-in, and so he tried to cover it up. And it's going to be his cover-up, his lying, and his trying to obstruct justice. That's ultimately what's going to do him in. And so the Republicans, his own party, are going to turn against him, and it's quite clear that he's going to be impeached in the House and removed from office in the Senate. But before those things can happen, he resigns. Nixon does not want to be the first president to be impeached and removed from office. The only other president before that period that had been impeached was Johnson in the 1860s during Reconstruction, but Johnson was not removed. So Nixon didn't want that embarrassment, so he resigned instead and left office. Now, since that period, we've had two other presidents that have been impeached. Clinton was impeached, and President Trump has been impeached. Neither one of those were removed from office either. So Nixon would have been removed from office through impeachment, but he resigned before that could happen. So that's what the Watergate scandal is all about, and that's going to end the Nixon presidency.